my good friend Jordan Peterson. Jordan, great to have you back on Uncensored. You contacted me because you don't agree necessarily with my views of Tommy Robinson. I think we share a lot of views, probably even with him, about the rape gang scandal. There's much to discuss here. First of all, the rape gang scandal itself, with your expert psychologist eye, what has happened here to make so many people so afraid to call it out for what it was, which was predominantly British Pakistani Muslim men abusing, raping, drugging young, often underage, white English girls?
All right, so let's think of 4 bins of complexity that surround the issue. Okay, so the first is the racial divide that typifies the crimes. So it's Pakistani Muslim immigrants and white working class young girls. So there's a racial, ethnic, and religious divide that is part and parcel of the crime. Then there's a class issue in the UK with regards to the victims and also the whistleblowers like Robinson. Then there's the meta problem of the difference between Islam and Christianity. The additional problem that psychopathic sadists use religious justification to camouflage and justify their crimes. Then there's the problem of open borders and immigration and the progressive presumption that all cultures, no matter their difference, are valuable in their diversity and can be integrated peacefully into society at, what would you say, an indefinite rate. Okay, and then to add another level of complexity, there's the politicking between the progressives and the right wing with regards to all the issues I just described. Okay, so that's like an absolute bloody rat's nest. And there's lies in every one of those, along every one of those dimensions that are extraordinarily deep and pervasive. And so I was very apprehensive about this discussion with you, Pierce, because there's almost no way of weaving, let's say, our way through this without making egregious errors.
Yeah.
So, okay, so well, let's, on the psychological side, let's point out 2 primary realities. The first is that sexual misbehavior of even of the sadistic kind is to be expected. You might think about it as an aberration from the norm, but it's only an aberration when the norm is deep and profound and the consequence of many years of socialization and centuries of history. Like the default position for an unguarded woman worldwide and throughout history has been rape target. That's the norm, not the civilized conduct that generally obtains between men and women, even in public, like on the streets in the West. And then there's the additional issue that resentful, psychopathic, sadistic, low-status, desperate men will use any excuse whatsoever to get access to women. So those are just some of the ugly realities that we have to contend with to weave our way through this complete bloody mess.
Yeah, and it is very complex, but at the heart of it, you also have a massive cover-up where people from local government, from the main federal government, police, social workers, almost everybody whose job it is to protect particularly vulnerable young girls in society. I mean, I can't think of a group you would more want to protect or throw the force of the establishment protective arm around than vulnerable young girls. At every level, they conspired to not just fail them, but they failed them in many cases deliberately because they didn't want to, in their eyes, let off a tinderbox, a racial tinderbox, by telling people, hey, you know what's happened here? A very large number of British Pakistani Muslim men have been systematically raping young, damaged white girls, in some cases not damaged before they got their hands on them, for a very, very long time, and we've done very little about it. And they didn't want to say this because they were terrified that there would be a huge scandal around that, and there would be a lack of, there would be unrest in communities and so on, which to me seems the ultimate immoral cowardice.
Well, okay, I think there's two things going on there, Pierce. The first is the certainty that anyone who would blow the whistle would be subject to the worst possible of cancellations by the woke mob. And this is partly why I have some sympathy for Tommy Robinson, let's say, because it is definitely the case that to take a stand against this is to make yourself a target for the worst sort of calumny and legal action. So the threat is real. And the cancel culture types are very good at identifying individuals and bringing reputation savaging to bear on them in an extremely effective way. So people had reason to be afraid. Now, I'm not saying that that fear justifies their silence or their complicity, but we have to be clear about the fact that their fear is real.
Yeah.
Now, there's another aspect to that that's even uglier than this, I think, Pierce, which is that, look, we know that when you destabilize a community with rapid transformation, this could be, let's say, with regards to the green agenda that makes energy more expensive, or to uncontrolled immigration, any rapid change with economic consequences demolishes the lower rungs of the socioeconomic hierarchy most particularly, right? They say that when the aristocracy catches a cold, the working class die of pneumonia, and that's a deep biological and sociological truth. Now, one of the corollaries of that, and this is where it gets ugly, is that it's very easy for the elite, especially in a relatively class-based system like the UK, to virtue signal about their progressive openness and their cosmopolitan sophistication, while sacrificing the genuinely poor and dispossessed, so the English working class, to the depredations of whatever virtue signaling policy happens to be conveniently at hand. And so partly it's cowardice, partly it's fear of say, being singled out and canceled, but it's also partly willingness on the part of the elite to sacrifice the genuinely downtrodden and poor to their moral presumptions, to their costless virtue signaling. And that happens consistently throughout the West now. Almost all the progressive agenda, including the open immigration policies, are absolutely devastating to the people who can least afford to be devastated. So I would say the elite in Great Britain made a choice to sacrifice the children of working class Brits to the moral grandstanding of their progressive elitism. And that's in addition to the absolute cowardice that, had some justification in real fear, because there was a cost. And I think that's why Robinson is such a complex figure, because, you said in your introduction, you're not very happy about his documentary. And I don't know what to make of that documentary, the one that, as you said, savaged the reputation of the Syrian immigrant. There's so many layers of lies surrounding absolutely everything that's part and parcel of this complete bloody catastrophe that it's very difficult to get to the truth.
Yeah, I mean, look,
but one of the things that we can say is that...
Yeah, I mean, look, on Robinson, here's what I would say.
Yep.
I watched your interview with him. I've interviewed him myself. He's not he's not stupid. He's very articulate. He speaks in a very passionate manner. But the things I have a problem with Robinson about are this. One is, I don't think people in America, it seems to me, in the last week, since Elon Musk did a torch to all this, and in my opinion, probably did us a massive favour as a country, notwithstanding a lot of the things he said, I think, have been quite problematic in terms of the vitriol on certain individual members of Parliament. For example, he targeted one female member of Parliament, Jess Phillips, who then got immediate death threats. People are now being arrested in connection with those death threats. It is serious because 2 members of Parliament in Britain have been murdered in the last 10 years by people who didn't agree with their opinions. So I think there's a responsibility that Elon has, which he has to tread carefully about in how he says things about public officials. However, he's absolutely right to say that this is a scandal that hasn't gone away, that the cover-up has never been properly investigated, that people were never held properly accountable, that no one has gone to prison who was at any level of responsibility for trying to protect these girls. None of them were properly held to account. All of that, I think, is a valuable thing that Elon Musk has now made everyone think about properly. And the only answer to me is a full independent national inquiry to get to the bottom of all of it and then to hold people properly accountable. My problem with Robinson being the so-called hero of this is that many people in America, and I'm not saying you're one of them, I'm sure you now know a lot more about him perhaps than you did before, but Robinson is not in prison right now for anything to do with the gang rape scandal. He's in prison because of this movie he made, this documentary, as he put it, as a journalist, which I don't think he is. He's someone who made a film after he was convicted in a court by a judge of being seriously defamatory to a young Syrian refugee boy who he tried to make out was the villain of a bullying incident that went viral because there was a clip, when in fact he was the victim. The judge made it crystal clear in his very extensive ruling, which I read at length last night. It's many, many pages. It's extremely detailed. It includes his analysis of all the witness statements, what the school had told him, all the documentary evidence, everything. There's no doubt that the judge's conclusion is that the victim was the victim, that the boy who did the bullying in the video that went viral, Bailey, who was befriended by Tommy Robinson, that he was also a victim in many ways of the firestorm that erupted after this story went viral. He also made it clear that Bailey had not had a racial motivation that he could establish against a Syrian refugee, which had been the original narrative that went out there. So it was very educational, this judgment, in many ways. He getting to the bottom of what had happened. But he also made clear that the 5 witnesses which Robinson brought to court to try and support his proposition that this Syrian refugee was the bad one of the two, that all of their evidence was lacking in credibility. In fact, he called it, he said some of them had clearly invented their testimony completely. And he was very scathing about the quality of the evidence of everyone that Robinson brought there. And in the end, he found Robinson guilty of defamation. He fined him £100,000 and I think £700,000 in legal costs. And he made it crystal clear to him, do not repeat these lies about this Syrian refugee boy, Jamal, again. And all that Robinson did was go away and repeat them to absolutely everyone, including in this film, to wide audiences. And they are ultimately lies, as proven in a very forensic and extensive court case held by a very eminent judge. So my problem with Robinson is that he's trying to portray himself as this great martyr who's been, had lawfare put against him by the British establishment to silence him, when in fact it was his refusal to be silenced and to repeat lies about this young Syrian refugee boy, which is why he's in prison. Secondly, my problem with him, Jordan, if I'm honest, is I don't know how many Americans or people in America who've been following this, because I see all the stuff on social media, they just don't seem to understand that Robinson's criminal record is highly extensive and very unpleasant. So, for 20 years, he's been breaking the law. He attacked an off-duty police officer. He led a hooligan group of football thugs in a brawl involving 100 people. He headbutted a man in Blackburn. He used a false passport to get round the fact he had criminal convictions in the UK to get into America and was caught. He perpetrated mortgage fraud, over £160,000. He was then found in contempt of court twice for turning up at court cases involving people who had been accused of committing these heinous crimes of grooming and raping these girls, nearly wrecking the trials because he was saying defamatory things in public outside the courtroom. And then we come to the refugee story, in which he's now back in prison again. And he was found guilty of stalking a journalist and accusing her partner of being a paedophile. This is not a nice guy. This is a pretty repellent human being who also simultaneously has been right to bang on for many years about the scandal of the rape gangs. So yes, he's complicated, but at the heart of it is somebody who I think also, just finally on the point of Robinson, 2 points I'd make. One, I think he's done this, he's monetized his hatred of Islam. It has warped, in my view, all his so-called journalism, activism, whatever he wants to call it, because it's always skewed against Muslims. It's never fair and balanced in any way. And I think that's what tipped him over the edge with this story of this boy at the school. And, you know, on that, the bully, the alleged bully, was actually kicked out of the school before this ever got made public by the media. So they'd already had their own investigation, concluded he was guilty not just of that, but a litany of other similar offences. So he was thrown out. But I also think that Robinson, and this is a slightly more complicated and insidious thing about him, I think he's been deliberately amplified and promoted by the people who have most to lose from exposure, justified exposure, because if they can make Robinson the guy that is trying to expose them, he's so discredited, particularly in the UK, that people won't take it seriously. And that's one of the reasons why there hasn't been more action, is because the leading whistleblower is Tommy Robinson. So I see problems in all of this with him, but notwithstanding, as I said at the start, I do think he's been absolutely right that this has been a massive scandal which has shamed the country, and that it needs proper national inquiry to get to the bottom of it. So that's where I sit with Robinson.
Yeah, well, I've been following the rape gang scandal for, I would say, 15 years, but the primary source of information for me in Canada has been Tommy Robinson, and his insistence on pursuing this come what may was part of the reason that I looked into it. And I think that's probably the case for Elon Musk as well. And it's an open question how much of a monster you have to be to shrug off all the accusations and the reputation savaging, and to put and the threats to your own existence and to your family's existence, to sally forth regardless and bring these issues to public attention, you know, over a decade, let's say. And you know, it might be wonderful for us to presume that the person who does that would also be of unimpeachable ethical character on all dimensions simultaneously. But we've seen the silence of people with unimpeachable characters in the face of this onslaught, and it doesn't bode well for them. So, and then the other thing I would say too, this isn't exactly in defense of Robinson. You know, that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to weave my way through this. But there's another ugly issue here, Pierce, that no one will grapple with, which is, you know, you described Robinson as anti-Muslim, let's say. Well, we don't really understand the relationship between the religious doctrine, let's say, and the fact of these crimes. Now, I want to make two cases here. You know, the first case is that 40 out of 50 Muslim majority countries in the world are authoritarian hellholes. And only 3 of them are democracies. And that's Morocco, Indonesia, and Turkey. And, you know, they're not, I wouldn't put them in the highest echelons of stellar states. And so why is that exactly? Is that a deviation from Islamic principles, or is it a consequence of them? Now, no one wants to have that discussion, and it's no bloody wonder, you know, and then, so that's on the negative side, let's say. And there are certainly doctrines in Islam that are very, very difficult to square with free, liberal, Western, Christian democracies. And those differences aren't just apparent, they're deep. Now, I would say on the optimistic side that we could turn to Islamic leaders like those who run the United Arab Emirates, and even to some degree now Saudi Arabia, and the signatories of the Abraham Accords, to find a different pathway. There have been stellar leaders, both from Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who've come out and said that publicly, very publicly, that they've got their Islamic fundamentalists under control and firmly in hand, and are completely undiluted as to their danger. But Europeans are virtue signaling so hard on the progressive side that the fundamental danger from Islamic fundamentalism is going to come from Europe and the UK, and not from the Arab states. Now, Tommy Robinson has been pilloried as anti-Islam, but there's a discussion to be had here. And no one wants to have it. And, you know, you said we need a national inquiry. It's like we need more than a national inquiry. We need something like an international symposium on the relationship between the Christian West and the Islamic world, because there are ugly things afoot, and they've manifested themselves in the most hideous of all possible ways in the UK with regards to these rape crimes and the cover-up. But there's something that needs to be sorted out at the bottom of all this. And one of those is, like, you talk about moderate Muslims. Like, I looked up the polling data today that Winston Marshall, for example, referred to when he interviewed Nigel Farage. And, you know, it's about 3/4 of UK Muslims would be perfectly content if Sharia law happened to be the, what would you say, the principle of the day for the UK as a whole. And that it would be fine if Islam became the national religion. Now, that's 75%. So, you know, a cynic would say, okay, just exactly where the hell are these moderates? And at minimum, their voice needs to be amplified. And then we could also point out that the participation in these rapes by members of the Pakistani Muslim community, it was like 1 in 7 of the men in some of these communities was directly involved. And that meant everyone knew about it. Absolutely everyone on the Pakistani Muslim side. And the moderates were certainly, you know, silent and complicit. Now, obviously, so were the authorities. And so that's a complete bloody catastrophe for everyone involved. But there's a serious conversation to be had in the West, and particularly in the UK, maybe France and Germany in secondary place, about just exactly how it is that liberal Western democracies, with their emphasis on the rights of women, can live side by side with Islam in general, especially the sort of Islam that's transformed into enabling fundamentalism that allows this sort of criminality on the part of the psychopathic, resentful, psychopathic sadists.
So
no
here's
one wants to have that conversation.
Well, listen, I think any conversation is worth having, no question. I would point out that one of the most heinous gang rape stories of modern times just got exposed in France with that poor woman whose husband was drugging and having a rape by. Now, what was fascinating about that from a social point of view was just the sheer range of predominantly white local men from all walks of life who thought it was perfectly okay to go and rape a drugged woman in her bed and be videoed doing so. I mean, I found that utterly heinous and reprehensible. So it's not just like this is a problem which is only in the Pakistani British Muslim community. It's not. Having said that, this is clearly...
Definitely. Look, definitely not.
But the other point I would make,
like,
Jordan, the other point I make, Jordan, is...
Between,
let me make the point. What I was going to make on a wider point is that there are roughly, I think, about the same number of Muslims in the UK and the US. We have disproportionately higher than the US in terms of the size of our population. I think it's about 5-6 million in both, something around there. And it's still true that the vast majority of Muslims in both the UK and the US are not extremist, lead their lives completely peacefully. The UK has always come out pretty much on top of all the surveys of tolerance and diversity and a good, safe, pretty good place to live. We had a big problem with ISIS extremists a few years ago, but we managed to tackle that. And thanks to Donald Trump and others in America, ISIS, until recently, has been kept very firmly back in its box and not been able to commit the same outrages. But I certainly didn't get a sense that all the Muslims in Britain were racing to be part of ISIS. They weren't. The extremists, as they are in every religion, are the exception, not the norm. And it's a pretty perilous road we go down if we start to say, well, the whole Muslim community is at fault here, which, by the way, Tommy Robinson has said, after the 7/7 bombings a few years ago on the buses and the underground system here, a heinous series of 4 terror attacks in London. Tommy Robinson went up and basically accused all Muslims of being complicit, all of them, and later retracted it. But that's why when I say Tommy Robinson is an Islamophobe, I don't think he doesn't hide it. He might deny it, but he doesn't hide it from his own rhetoric. He is somebody that despises Islam and believes that all Muslims were to blame when there were terrorist attacks by extremists in London. And I think that is dangerous rhetoric. So I think that there is a conversation.
Well, it's clearly dangerous.
Absolutely
It's clearly dangerous.
The conversation has to be nuanced.
Okay,
and it has to be careful. Would you accept that?
I agree. Well, let's take absolutely. That's for sure. I mean, let's take it apart a little bit more. Then, I mean, first of all, there are reasons that the authorities were afraid to act in the manner that they should have. Now, they were afraid partly because they would be pilloried by their confreres on the radical left, because the progressives are very good at reputation savaging their own.
Yeah.
But they're also afraid of a Islamic fundamentalist backlash and the murderousness that might accompany that. So there's a reason they're afraid. And Pierce, you also didn't address my issue, and I'm not accusing you of anything. I don't expect you to have the answers because this is too complex. But you know, the fact that only 3 of 50 Muslim majority polities in the world, states, are democratic, even approximating democratic, it's like, what the hell are we to make of that exactly? Like, look, first of all, you pointed to the fact that there are psychopathic sadists, dark tetrad types, right? Machiavellian, narcissistic, psychopathic, and sadistic. That's the constellation of personality traits. And that's a human constant. It's about 3 to 5% of the population. And that's independent of race and ethnicity. So, like, there's no shortage of bad actors. And you're right to point to that rape case in France. There were 75,000 people in the chat groups associated with that rape case, fantasizing about doing exactly the same sort of thing to their wives or to someone else's wife. There's no bottom to the darkness of the human soul. And the bloody progressives tend to be absolutely blind to that fact. Now, so you can't point to the Muslims, let's say, and say, well, that's where all the psychopaths are, because clearly that's not the case. But that does still it still allows this other can of worms to remain uninvestigated, which is, so 100% of Protestant or Catholic majority countries outside of Africa are highly functional democracies. 100%. 6% of Muslim majority countries are democracies, and they're not in the highly functional category.
But do they want to be democracies, Jordan? But Jordan, do they actually want to be democracies? I mean, we have a slightly quaint view in places like the UK that we are the exemplar for how a country should operate. When I was in Qatar, for example, for the World Cup, the Football World Cup, I met some of the high-ranking Qataris, including people who were related to the Emir, and they were kind of laughing at the idea that they would look at the UK as a template for how a society should exist, with our knife crime, our drug abuse, our
it's
drunkenness.
easy to say that.
I'm throwing it back at you. They were genuinely bemused. They were genuinely bemused that we would think here that somehow the way our country operates is the exemplar that they should be adopting.
Okay, well, so this is what I would say to that is, first of all, you're right, but that also makes the problem that I'm addressing in some ways, or bringing to light, even more stark, because it isn't necessarily the case that the denizens of the Islamic world look to progressive Western democracies as the ideal, but that turns out to be a problem if you're importing them en masse, because their fundamental predisposition might not be democratic, and yet they're in a democratic society. So it isn't obvious what to do about that. Okay, the next thing I would say is it's pretty bloody easy for the rich Muslim countries who are absolutely awash in, I would say, undeserved oil money to moralize about the superiority of their culture. I mean, the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia were a little, fringe tribal cult before the West stupidly dumped $1 trillion on them and allowed them to propagandize the entire world. They would have been a backwoods Arab tribe lost in the desert forever if it wasn't for oil money. We're unbelievably naive on that front. Now, look, I do believe that the actions that the UAE and Saudi Arabia and the signatories of the Abraham Accords, the actions that they've undertaken in the last 10 years do indicate to me that there's a pathway forward to rapprochement with moderate Islam if we're smart and careful. But we should heed the warnings of the Saudis and the UAE people themselves and address the problem of psychopathic fundamentalism in our own culture. And instead, what we do is we allow them unlimited license to rape and pillage for racially motivated reasons, and then hide it and pretend that it's okay.
See, I agree with all that.
Problem.
Yeah, I agree with all
problem.
that. I agree with that. I think it's, as you said at the start, very complex, but I completely agree with what you just said, and it is completely true. We have been warned, by the Saudis. We just saw that recent attack in Germany where there were explicit warnings that the Saudis made to German authorities about one of their extremists, which were not heeded. And then they reaped the appalling consequences. So I completely concur with that. Well, I also think that we should be encouraging these countries, like Saudi and the others, to continue on the path they've been going, because ultimately that's where we would like them to go, right?
Well, the alternative is war, right? I mean, that's the alternative, and war of the worst kind. I mean, the UAE sheikh said directly that, and implicitly, that it's up to the West to distinguish between psychopathic fundamentalists manipulating religion for their own sadistic and hedonistic ends, and the moderate, typical Muslim immigrant that you're speaking of. Well, we don't, because we're so damn cowardly. We let we accept the hypothesis that the Muslim community is in some sense monolithic. We don't separate the psychopathic fundamentalists. We don't separate the wheat from the chaff. And then we leave the moderate Muslims in some ways at the mercy of the absolute psychopathic fundamentalists. And then we whitewash that as a kind of liberal progressiveness. And there's just no excuse for that. And you might say, well, what's the evidence for that? It's like, well, how about the rape? We don't even know how many girls were raped in the UK, right? The estimates range from tens of thousands to 1 million. It's like, really, how can you get the numbers that wrong? How dense and blind, willfully so, how virtue signaling and cowardly do you have to be to get the numbers that wrong?
Yeah, I think the reality is, I think that the numbers, a lot of numbers have been flying around. I think it's the number of rapes is staggeringly high. The number of actual victims who were exposed to multiple rapes is undetermined, but it's not at the level that you may think it is. I think it's the volume of rapes that they believe may have been committed. In other words, these poor girls were being gang raped on a daily basis by sometimes a dozen people. So when you add up the number of times they were raped, you're getting to catastrophically high numbers, and it is utterly shameful. And the cover-up is even more shameful. And that, for all that reason, I think that however rough and tumble the rhetoric may have been from people like Elon Musk this week in going after the leaders here, if at the end of the day it does force a genuine, independent, wide-ranging national inquiry to genuinely get to the bottom of it, it will be worth it. I do believe that.
Jordan, would you say the same thing about Tommy Robinson?
Well, the thing I say about Tommy Robinson...
he's even more rough and tumble, let's say.
Yeah, he is. I think the thing about Tommy Robinson is to be completely clear-eyed about what he is, what his record is, and simple things like why he's in prison now. It suits him for America, where he makes a lot of money, because he's been deplatformed in many places here. It suits him in America for Americans to believe he is a political prisoner. Now, I agree with Elon Musk that it is highly unusual, if unprecedented, for someone who was found guilty in a civil case of defamation to now be in solitary confinement, potentially for over a year.
In a maximum security prison.
I think
that is a little on the odd side,
I think it's unacceptable and wrong. What we don't know is there are reports, which have not been established either way, that may be at his request for his own safety. So
yeah, but I know why it's at his request, Piers. It's at his request because the prison they put him in is so dangerous that if he wasn't in solitary, his life would be in danger. And that's the point I was going to make. So it is at his request. But
I think, look, we don't know quite enough about that. I just think it is inhuman to put somebody in solitary for the length of time that they are planning to put him, given the nature of the crime he's in there for. That is inhuman, it's unfair, it's unjust. And you can have that view whilst also having my view about Robinson, that even if some of his message about all of his message about the drug and rape and booze scandal of these poor girls, all of that has been an important message to have had the drum banged by him for a long time. It's the other stuff around him which is very unpalatable.
We should clarify something. We should clarify something about those rapes too, just to flesh out the picture on the psychological side. You know, because the terminology is grooming gang, and then the next most accurate terminology is rape gang. But that's not right. We're still a long ways from the truth, because it's not just rape. It's brutal, sadistic, demeaning, racially motivated rape with what would you say? That sadistic overlay of unnecessary torture and pain, right? So it's rape of the most sadistic and brutal kind. Yeah. This isn't date rape.
No.
This isn't, oh my God, a relationship went wrong.
Yeah, I agree.
It isn't misunderstanding that it's brutal beyond comprehension.
It is.
And that's partly why it's blown up in the last couple of weeks.
I mean, again, in the same way that I think people should read the judgment of the Tommy Robinson civil defamation case, because it will inform them better than most people seem to be informed about him and his motivation for that film he produced. I also think it's incumbent on people to actually read some of the gruesome detail of what these girls were put through from the cases which have gone through the courts and led to people getting lengthy prison sentences, because it is beyond belief how despicable and sadistic it was. And I completely concur with that. Jordan, I want to just ask you something completely separate, which is Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, an old bête noire of yours, but finally falling on his woke sword, the man who hectored a young female student for using the word mankind. He said, around here we use the phrase people kind, so we don't offend people. I think that mindset from a man who also regularly wore blackface while lecturing us all about racism is long overdue that he's gone. His record with policies in Canada has been disastrous as well. But what is your reaction to Trudeau going?
Well, I watched his resignation speech. You know, I've never heard Justin Trudeau say a true word in his entire life. I'm a pretty astute clinician, and I can, if I pay attention, I can tell the difference between someone who's, you know, merely wrong and trying his best, and someone who just lies with every single breath. And he is definitely a person like that. Everything he does is an act. And his resignation speech was an act. You could tell because today he started out with the words, well, everyone knows that I'm a fighter and I don't give up. And I mean, Pierce, I don't know about you, but I can't imagine myself ever saying something like that in public. Who would say that?
I know.
I'm a fighter.
Especially as you're giving up.
Really?
Especially as you're literally giving up.
Well.
It's like, I quit, but I'm not a quitter. You know, yes, you are. You're literally quitting in front of our eyes.
Yeah. Well, and it's also the case that you saw in that opening salvo exactly his preoccupation with himself.
Yeah.
It's like, this is all a drama about Justin Trudeau as far as Justin Trudeau is concerned. You all know I'm a fighter. It's like, actually, Justin, at the moment, we don't give a damn if you're a fighter. Actually, we don't give a damn about you, period. This isn't about you. It's about the fact that over 9 years, you have moved Canadians from parity in terms of per capita GDP. We were equal to the Americans 9 years ago, equal. And now we're at 60%, which is also, by the way, the case for you guys in the UK. And that's 100% attributable to Justin Trudeau and his nightmarish, woke, leftist, weak policies. And it's exactly the same cabal of self-serving narcissists that have been in power so often in the UK and that are responsible for the clamorous silence surrounding these sadistic rape gangs. And I'm so glad he's gone. He was a curse. My country is in worse shape by far than I've ever seen it in my entire life. And we don't have any idea yet how much damage he did, because all we know is what we've heard with the Liberals in power. And the true picture is going to be much more hideous than has already been exposed. And the most likely outcome is this is all going to be dumped on Pierre Poilievre, and he's going to have to take the hit for it. What did he say? I interviewed him last week. He said, the Liberals had the party and I get the hangover. And it's like, yeah, well, he'll get the hangover all right, get blamed for it all, and Canadians are going to suffer dreadfully.
Yeah.
And it's really awful. And it is this shallowness, this shallow self-serving narcissism that characterizes so much of the elite class, more or less across political lines, that has put Canada in the doldrums that it's in, and is also responsible for the state of your country, which is dreadful. And it's I don't know if you guys in the UK understand how sad it is for us in Canada and in the United States to watch what you're doing to yourself. I mean, the UK is a great country. When I go there, I go to Oxford, I go to Cambridge, to these remarkable places in London, see your unbelievable deep history, understand how much the world owes the UK in terms of, say, the establishment of common law and decent government everywhere, including places like India. We owe the UK such an immense debt. And to watch you guys like spiral yourselves into the ground for this idiot, weak political correctness that's gone so far that you can allow your working class women to be raped en masse sadistically and say nothing about it, and gaslight people who are telling the truth. It's so sickening.